Hello everyone. This is the second video lecture of the second set of lectures on at Naked and the Nude class, and in this lecture I'd like to focus on deliberately to the second millennium BCE in Mesopotamia, particularly the Middle and Bronze Ages, as I mentioned in my previous lecture, and this corresponds roughly to sometime between 2000 BCE to 1200 BCE. To talk about the mass-produced clay figurines and terracotta plaques, which were widely available as part of the everyday life around this time. And this is the time that these kinds of objects became sort of really mass-produced and found in various houses. As I mentioned in the last video, these figurines really relate to a set of religious practices and magical rituals, and they clearly play an important performative role or an indexical role, replacing as a substitute in certain rituals. For example, this set of mold-made clay figurines excavated at the site of Susa in western Iran depict the frontally depicted sort of nude female figure who is holding her breasts and has an elaborate hairdo, wears jewelry and diadems, as well earrings and chokers and pendants, and their pubic hair is articulated with a series of a row of curls. They're about 17 centimeters in height, about 7 inches tall, and conventionally speaking, these figures are interpreted usually as fertility figures, and I'm going to try to argue against this. But since this frontal pose representation of the body parts and provocative gestures and adorned bodies suggests something closer to the concept of kuzbu that I mentioned at the end of my previous lecture. Kuzbu is actually defined as sexual allure as divine power or divine charm. This nude female holding her breasts becomes extremely widespread in Mesopotamia, Iran, and the Levant in this sense. In fact, these Mesopotamian sort of representations go back to the late 3rd millennium BCE, with more handmade examples from the Ur III period, or the 3rd dynasty of Ur, found in the cities of the southern alluvium. And I show you some more of these handmade examples that are found in the Oriental Institute Museum around the corner in Hyde Park. So, and that these, and in the 2nd millennium, as we move after 2000, we see them, these images actually being produced in sort of great quantities with the technology and mold-made technology that I will speak about in a little bit. So somehow we have to kind of really account for what's going on, right? And so and I'm sharing with you a kind of a court poem in Sumerian from this time period of those handmade figurines that I just showed you. This is from the court of Shusin, one of the kings of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, from the city of Ur. And so it says, "My God, the tyrant keeper, her beer is sweet. Her vulva is sweet, like her beer, and her beer is sweet. And her vulva is sweet, like her mouth, and her beer is sweet. Her cuspir beer and her regular beer are sweet." So you see this kind of eroticism that is expressed here and perhaps aligns really well with this kind of visual culture of divine sexuality and divine sexual allure that we were just talking about in the figurines. Actually, really the important reason why we know so much about such a good record of this material religion in the early second millennium in ancient Mesopotamia is because really of the fact that the archaeologists were interested in excavating not only just temples and palaces and tombs and really fancy places to find fancy finds, but they were also interested in excavating houses and neighborhoods of ordinary people where ordinary people lived. And I'm showing you one example here. There are several, actually, but this one is particularly important from the 1920s excavations by Leonard Woolley on the behalf of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania. The excavations at Ur that uncovered a second millennium neighborhood, like street by street and block by block, with little shrines, little bakeries, winding alleys, little squares. Leonard Woolley even went ahead and gave names to some of the streets as well, just to make us familiarize with these. And here you see Leonard Woolley excavating a neighborhood shrine uncovering actually a cult statue, one of the sort of rare examples of a cult statue that we have from Mesopotamian cities, particularly in the small neighborhood shrines. So all of this kind of really allowed us to get a closer look at the religion and the everyday life of ordinary citizens. So I'm showing you here a baked clay mold of a nude female figure, again depicted frontally and holding her breasts. And this is a mold that could be used to make thousands and thousands of these terracotta plaques. This is only about 12 centimeters in height. So we're really talking about things that you can hold in the palm of your hand. And what is noticeable here is that the figure is, if you look at this female figure, we see that she has a horned crown and wings, and talons, talon feet, and so which all suggests that we're looking at not at an ordinary woman, but a goddess. So here I'm showing you actually perhaps the best known example of such representations, a baked clay terracotta relief from the British Museum, a relatively large one with a height of about half a meter. So we're talking about a fairly sort of large example here. Quite monumental in its size, and it's unusual to have such a big mold-made terracotta plaque, and it's dated to the 19th or 18th centuries BCE, somewhere in the Old Babylonian period. The rectangular relief panel has a very high relief representation. It's actually very high workmanship, and in terms of its details compared to the other more sort of mundane and everyday pieces that we have. This is the high relief representation of a frontally depicted nude female figure with wings, frontally depicted and wearing a divine head crown. She is fascinatingly holding on her raised two hands a rod and a ring, which really means, some of you may remember the rod and the ring from a survey in the stele of Hammurabi, where a rod and a ring was being presented to him by Shamash as an insignia of kingship, an insignia of being a just king, or having kind of a really kingly justice or social justice. So this actually allows us to associate her with kind of justice and kingship as well. So she's standing on two addorsed lions, sitting back to back, about symmetrically, which the lions are sitting on some kind of a scaled pattern landscape, which signifies a mountain or some kind of a rocky terrain. That's how the Mesopotamians represented that. And so she also has this kind of really highly elaborate talon feet. And flanked by two odd-looking owls, also looking straight at the weaver. This mesmerizing image was associated with, by art historians, some goddess of the underworld, to represent a goddess of the underworld because of the talons and the headdress. Also, maybe Eresh Kigal, it's hard to know. But I think that you get the sense of what is meant by Kuzbu in Akkadian is really very clearly expressed in this representation. Another concept that I'd like to introduce here is the Sumerian concept of May, which I think is very crucial for our understanding of Mesopotamian material world. So May is originally really translated as divine ordinances, decrees, translated sometimes as foremost rituals, the essence, or a thing's divinely ordained essence. The May then is actually a kind of a divine power, the intrinsic powers or characteristics of divine beings that make the essential activities within the natural and civilized worlds exist and function properly. They are they are really given to you, to kings, to buildings, to individuals, to cities, to countries, to beautifully made artifacts, to art. And what is really fascinating about that is that they are, as divine powers and imaginations, these become, once you receive a May, then it becomes materially manifest in the real world. In the objects and spaces and bodies that are touched or infused by such supernatural agencies. So it's not a representational or spiritual entity, it's not a symbol, but it's an ontological entity. Once you have May, you have this iridescence is a material quality. And so I would like you to understand the concept of Kuzbu itself, which is a form of May, some kind of sexual allure that is expressed in the frontal female nudity, as where female nudity appears as a kind of an erotic power, a materialization or manifestation of Kuzbu. So finally, I'd like to wrap up this discussion by showing you a set of the more everyday terracotta plaques. And I'd like you to sort of really consider this idea of the May and the divine power, and how these things actually could be endowed to both objects and bodies, or in humans and animals and so on. As I indicated, these are religious and magical in context, in content, and more likely to accomplish a certain physical impact on the real social world. example is this kind of mold-made clay relief figure depicting a nude mythical male figure and from the Old Babylonian period, who's holding a vessel out of which water is coming out. So it's a representation of kind of an anthropomorphized representation of maybe the idea of the spring, water coming out of a pot. And sometimes we see scenes of couples like this. This one excavated by Woolley at the Diktika Mound near Ur, possibly a kind of a suburb of Ur. This unusual one showing a woman drink, and we see a man and a woman perhaps on a platform, on a bed, together, and in a kind of a really intimate situation. We also have several instances of, this one is a particularly unusual one, showing a woman drinking from a jar that is resting on the ground, possibly beer, while being penetrated by a nude male from the behind. We also have several bed scenes where we see either a couple making love, or just a nude woman lying down, or simply a bed with a pubic triangle, or the Sal sign. So in writing in Sumerian, this is actually the Sal sign. It becomes a kind of a cuneiform sign for woman. So the female body is then reduced to this one sort of pictorial sign, a triangle. There are also really interesting sort of set of images from a variety of sites that you see here from Tel Adair, from Kish, from Isin, where we have a female with spread legs and a phallus. So I'd like to wrap up the discussion with a much later limestone nude statue of a woman, which comes from actually the very end of the time period that we're covering. It's dated to the 11th century BCE, the end of the second millennium. It's from a Middle Assyrian context. It was excavated by Hurmuzd-Resam at the Ishtar temple in Nineveh. And in 1853, so it's a very, very old sort of object. Its height is almost a meter high, and so about 3 feet, I would say. And what's really quite interesting is that, you know, the head and arms and feet are missing, but we have a really good sense of the overall image. This is a large-scale female nude sculpture. I would pose this as my most important sort of really evidence against Kenneth Clark's idea of the idea that the nude is invented in 5th century Greece. The body belongs to, if we study it closely, the body belongs to a young woman with full thighs and rounded breasts, and her pubic triangle is finely carved and detailed with curves, as we saw in the other frontal figurines and terracotta plaques. What is fascinating is that this sculpture is inscribed on the back with an inscription of the king. And so here is what it says. It's after giving the genealogy of the king Ashur-bal-Kala, who actually sponsored the making of the statue. He says, I made these sculptures in the provinces, cities, and garrisons for titillation. Which sets up, it's a statement that actually sets up to say that this female nude body then is presented as an object of visual pleasure. So the sculpture is associated then with eroticism, with sexual allure, rather than any kind of reference to fertility or reproduction, which is the interpretation that is proposed for many Western Asian representations of nude females. They're usually explained away easily with like fertility and reproduction, of course, and then nudity is associated with classical Greece. This, of course, really proves all of that conventional scholarship utterly wrong. So this concludes my lectures for your class. I'd like to thank Layli again for inviting me to present my work to you. So thank you very much and best of luck this semester.